Hello dear students, this is Business Research Methods and Project Work class. This is tutorial 2.1. The topic of discussion is research process and overview. Learning objectives are to understand the research process and to learn the various steps or stages of research process. Well, you have already get an idea about research. Research, that is the process of finding new knowledge or process for finding answer to some queries that arise in the mind of researcher, and answering those questions need to adopt some scientific methods, techniques, tools, or some designs. And these activities that the researcher need to adopt for conducting the research, these activities are interrelated and performed in a step-by-step manner or performed in a sequence, and therefore it forms a process. Suppose a researcher has identified a research problem and chosen the type of research design. She is required to decide accordingly the type of data to be collected, as also the detailed tabulation. The various steps of a research process are: it begins with problem identification, followed by choosing the research design, then determining the information need for the research. It is followed by designing the data collection forms or construction of the data collection tools, then determining sample design and sample size. After that, organizing and conducting the field survey, then processing and analyzing the collected data, and last, preparing the research report. Now, in each stages of the research process, some questions need to be addressed by the researcher. The first stage of the research process is identification of the problem for the research or formulating the research problem. Now, that problem identification, the meaning is that the researcher need to set the objectives of the study, and before setting the objectives, the researcher need to have clear idea about what the researcher is going to find or to which question the researcher is intending to conduct the research. And therefore, the questions that need to be addressed are: what is the purpose of the study? Is any background information available? What is likely to be the cost of information that may have to be collected? Is the research economically viable? So these are some of the questions that need to be addressed by the researcher in the very first stage. This stage is very crucial and very important because the problem identification, this guide the researcher in the follow-up stage. Now, the problem identification, that is followed by choosing the research design. So here the researcher try to have answer what is the nature of the problem. That means whether the questions that are arising in the mind of the researcher, whether that questions are totally new or any existing informations are available or existing research are there. If this is totally new, then in that time the researcher need to design in an exploratory way. That means the research design to be chosen is exploratory design. If the researcher is trying to establish and cause and effect relationship between some variables, then that study is going to adopt a causal research design, or that may be correlational type or regression analysis they're going to use in that particular study. So that is a causal research. And sometimes the researcher only try to describe the status that is prevailing in that time, so that is called descriptive research. Another question that need to be addressed in this stage is the scope of the proposed study. Then what type of study will it be? Whether it's exploratory, descriptive, or causal, or a combination of this. In practice, the research design found to be a combination of these three designs. After choosing the research design, the researcher need to determine the sources of data. Now there are broadly two sources of data. One is called primary source and another is called secondary source. Secondary source, that means already the data has been collected by somebody else, so data is available. Primary data, it means the researcher is going to collect it for the first time. So a decision need to be taken whether to take secondary data or primary data, or a mix of secondary data and primary data. Then what will be the source of primary data? That also need to be decided by the researcher. Then who will be the respondents for the study? So these questions need to be addressed by the researcher in this stage. After deciding the sources of data, if the researcher take the decision that primary data need to be collected, that time the concern goes to designing the data collection forms or construction of data collection tools. So here the questions are, what should be the mode of collection? Then whether to use observational method or the survey method. Should mechanical means or electronic means to be used in observation method? Should the questionnaire be administered in person or through mail or over the phone? Should measurement scales be used in the questionnaire? What specific scale or scales to be used? So these are some of the questions that need to be addressed in this stage. So in simple language, if the researcher is going to adopt observation method, that means the researcher is going to take note of the things or observing keenly. That time the researcher need to record it carefully and consciously. There, the whom the researcher is observing, they may not participate in the with the researcher. So that is a non-reactive approach. Whereas in case of survey method, the researcher is going to ask the respondent. So the information or the data, those are to be collected from the responses of the respondents, and there the researcher need to have a structured questionnaire. Sometimes the questionnaire may not be a structured one. If the researcher is going to conduct an interview and that interview is in-depth nature, that time the questions may arise in the real time, and there the researcher will collect the data or information. After designing the data collection forms, the next concern is determining sample design and sample size. Well, a sample is a representative of the population, but how it becomes representative, that again need to consider some factors. And before that, the researcher need to take the decision, is a sample necessary or not. If it is possible to cover 100% of the population, that time sample is not necessary because census is possible. But in many researches, actually census survey is not feasible because it is not only time consuming, but it also the cost factor also increases, and therefore the researchers, they need to conduct sample survey. So another question is, from which population sample is to be drawn? Is a list of population elements available? What type of sample it be? Probability or non-probability sampling? Within the probability sampling, what specific design is to be used? Then how large should be the sample be? So these questions need to be answered at this stage. After designing the sampling and determining the sample size, the researcher need to organize and conduct a field survey. So at this stage, the researcher need to take the decision whether the data is going to be collected by the researcher himself or herself, or the researcher is going to employ some enumerators for data collection. So here the question is, who will collect the data? That means if they are employing enumerators, then the researcher need to give training or acquaint the enumerator about the research. How long will the collection of data take? That means the time period for data collection. Has any special effort been made to ensure the quality of data collected? So these things need to be decided by the researcher in organizing and conducting the field survey. Once the data are collected and field survey is completed, the next work is processing and analyzing the collected data. So here the questions arise, who will be responsible for editing of the data? How will the data be coded? What method of tabulation will be used, manual or computer? Which methods will be used in analyzing data? Will computer be used for detailed analysis? Analyzing and processing of data followed by preparing the research report. The questions are, who will prepare the report? What is the competence of the person preparing the report? How far will statistical tables and charts be used? Will the report make recommendations and such related matters? So as we already discussed the stages of research process, here you need to note that these stages, as given in sequence, it is not necessary that these stages or steps will be always in the same sequence. Depending on the type of research, depending on the subject matter of the study, this sequence may vary. Thus, to summarize, the research